All right, so we'll quickly do an introduction. I'll introduce myself and Ruth will introduce herself. We do only have a half hour, so this might go a little bit quick, but we can share the slides if anybody is interested. So yeah, I'm Brian Douglas. I am one of the social workers with the school board. My home base is out of Waterloo, Oxford, and I support the feeder schools in this area. I'm also part of the critical events response team. And within that role, part of it is kind of traumatic response, but also supporting students, families, schools, classrooms through grief. So that's a snapshot of who I am. Do you want to introduce yourself, Ruth?
Sure. My name's Ruth Van Loon. I'm also a social worker at the school board, working out of the Preston area, Preston High School and feeder schools. And I also am a member of the critical events response team. So do the same things that Brian mentioned.
Yeah, so we are going to dive right into this. We do know grief can be a challenging, difficult topic, depending on where you're coming from with it. So please just take care of yourselves through it. We're not going to get into anything really heavy. This is really more educational today. There are a few moments for questions, so you can pop your answers if you have any into the chat. And we can address them there, and then we will leave some time at the end for any questions as well. All right. So the first question that we just want you to think about, again, you can add an answer in the chat if you want, but no pressure. But we just wanted to kind of pose the question that when you think about grief, what comes up for you? So again, you need to kind of close your eyes and think about that if you want to write that down personally. But yeah, just reflect on what comes up for you when you think about grief. We'll just kind of give that a minute. Okay. And the reason we kind of want people to reflect on grief, whether that's coming to mind definitions of grief, kind of personal reflections and experiences with grief, we wanted to take that time just because grief isn't a topic that we often openly communicate about. We're pretty grief phobic, for lack of better terms, within North American culture. We don't talk about death. We don't talk about dying. We feel like it's going to open up this big Pandora's box. So we just kind of don't talk about it and we just keep it contained. But again, our hope for this conversation this afternoon is that you'll walk away with kind of learning some new information, but also see the importance and the value of having these conversations. All right. Okay, all you, Ruth.
Okay, so we just wanted to start a little bit by talking about some of the terminology that surrounds grief. So just to understand some of the words that we use and what they mean. So grief is obviously somebody's response to a significant loss. And that doesn't have to be death specific. It can be kind of any loss like moving or divorce, family separation, incarceration, and then sometimes even things like grief over maybe not having a life that you had envisioned for yourself. Then there is bereavement, which is the state of having experienced a death. So we all know like terms like bereavement leave that are in things like employment, and that's just some time after a death that you're known to be experiencing the grief and mourning process. Then there's anticipatory grief, which is grief that happens prior to a death. Sometimes I think we think of it just as somebody's dying, that's a process that people might be going through, but it actually might be just when somebody receives a diagnosis or as we have aging relatives or that kind of thing that we're thinking and kind of anticipating a grief process. And then there's mourning, which is something that I think we think of often when we think of grief is kind of that external expression of how we're grieving, whether that be kind of at the funeral when we're thinking of that kind of process, like crying and just feeling the feelings. But it can happen in a number of ways and show up in a number of spaces. And then disenfranchised grief may be grief that's not accepted or acknowledged. But also it can mean that the griever is not given the space to grieve. So thinking about that disenfranchised grief, because that's something that we see a lot of. Can anybody think of examples that you want to throw in the chat of disenfranchised grief that kids might be experiencing?
Are you seeing anything in the? I'm not seeing a chat. Are you seeing anything?
Let me look. Sorry.
So someone had made a comment about complicated grief, so ends of relationship, but that was before your question. So
yeah, and that's kind of a fit. That's right. So kind of
and there are lots of different kinds. There's traumatic grief, complicated grief, prolonged. Like there's lots of different levels and aspects of grief. These are just kind of the ones we picked. But complicated grief. But in terms of disenfranchised grief, anybody having any examples? I can't see the chat. Okay, perfect. What do we got?
I see a lot about friendships ending, moving, that kind of thing, and those can definitely be griefs that aren't necessarily recognized by others, and maybe we aren't giving kids the space to deal with that kind of grief, and they are losses, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, people, and everyone for sharing. Okay, so what grief is not? We really wanted to kind of talk about things that grief isn't, because I think for a long time, everybody's kind of become familiar with the stages of grief. It was kind of developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in, I think it was just in the 70s. And when she originally kind of came up with this model of grief, it was actually in relation to a person who was actively dying. So these were stages that she kind of realized people who were diagnosed with a terminal illness or who were dying, they kind of went through, or she seemed in her research to go through these stages. But then what sort of happened is that got kind of assigned to grievers, to people who are grieving kind of death of people, and that we as a society then believe that we are all supposed to kind of go through these different stages, and that is how we grieve. But that is not at all what grief is. So Ruth is going to talk about what is a more accurate model, which is this.
Yeah. So we have two kind of different diagrams of grief. So the reality is that there's a lot of different parts of grief, a lot of different aspects beyond those kind of 5 stages, including some growth towards new things, which is something that we don't always think about when we think of grief. And the reality is that grief is not a clean, linear kind of experience like the first 5 stages would kind of tell us that it is. The reality is that we go through lots of different aspects of grief at different times, and it's messy and it's tangled, and there's no kind of right way to grieve. So the important thing is that we recognize that we can feel a number of different ways, and that it doesn't have to follow the 5 stages. We don't want people to feel like there's something wrong if they aren't kind of moving through 5 stages, or that they force themselves to contain their grief into stages instead of allowing themselves to feel whatever they need to feel. Another aspect is that grief is not something that we can fix. It's just something that we grow around, and this kind of model kind of demonstrates that through grief, there are some aspects of growth that happen, so that we are still grieving, but we have other things that come about as part of that, and that the grief kind of maybe informs our life and gives us some different pathways. And as those of us who are supporting someone who's grieving, our role really is to bear witness, to sit and be present with people without trying to problem solve or make things better. We don't make grief better. As you can see by this tangled mess that's on the kind of right side of the screen, it can be messy and it brings up a lot of feelings. So we need to just acknowledge it, let it show up, and let people feel sad, hurt, angry, or whatever emotion they're feeling, and just be there for them. And there's lots of different aspects also that we're not going to get into today, but that impact our grief. Like when you think about kind of religious backgrounds, our roles in relationships, identity, other aspects of identity and culture around us that impact the way that we're grieving.
So that leads us to kind of how do we support, grieving children, which Ruth and I do within our roles, right? So it's the responsibility, I'll just read the slide here. It's the responsibility of adults to take the lead in opening conversations about death and dying with kids. It is then kind of the child or the youth takes the lead in how much information they would like to then share. That could be through questions, that could be through just general conversations, but it really is our responsibility to open and to invite our kids into these conversations. What we know and what research has shown us is that when kids don't get accurate information, they use their imaginations to fill in the blanks. And that information is often inaccurate. It can lead to increased worries, anxieties, sleep struggles, like a whole bunch of things. Because again, they're filling in information with pieces that maybe they've heard or things they just are making up because they're trying to make sense of this grieving process. So again, it's our responsibility as the adults to lead and open those conversations, and then again, sharing within appropriate age information, and following their lead of how much information they want to have. It's also our role to ask and to explore with the kids, like what they think they know or what they maybe have overheard, and that they're not understanding, or to ask them what their understanding around this death is, so that again we can provide as the adults accurate information that is again age appropriate, so that they can try and process through that information again, as opposed to making things up or believing things that aren't actually true. There's one thing I've learned as a parent, but also within this role working with kids is they hear a lot, right? Whether even when we don't think they're listening, they're often listening, and it's sometimes those fragmented pieces that they hear that we, again, as the adults, need to try and tease apart. It's okay to share and to help educate kids, and to model for them that it's normal, it's natural, it's expected to have big feelings, and to share and to show those big feelings, but that it's also okay if they're not. So again, it's really meeting them where they're at and supporting them and reassuring them through the process. One thing we often hear, Ruth and I and the other members of the team, when we're working with students, is that they don't want to talk about grief and their person who died with the surviving parent or with grandparents or whoever, because they're really worried that it's going to make that person sad. So if dad has died, then they don't want to talk to mom about how much they miss dad, or vice versa, or whatever. And so we're always trying to remind and reassure them that they're already sad. Mom's already sad, dad's already sad, your brothers are, whoever, they're already sad. So you're not going to make them more sad by talking about them. That you're actually, they're probably actually going to be really proud of you for coming forward and for wanting to talk. And the other thing that I've learned kind of doing grief work outside of this role is people really actually enjoy having the opportunity to talk about the person who died. Because grief is it's a unique experience to everybody. It's a universal experience, but still unique. in that, you know, when we're grieving and we've had somebody in our lives die, we sit with that and we carry that grief forever. But everybody else around us moves on, and then they don't often think to check in and to talk about it. So again, finding ways to talk and have these open conversations um, is really important. And it also shows, again, this is where it goes back to that previous slide of it's our role to open those conversations, where it shows our kids that we can have really difficult conversations, really hard emotional conversations with them, and we as the adult can handle it, and that they as the child do not have to protect us, because I think that's often what we see is kids trying to protect their adults from feeling sad. And so again, it's our job to really reassure them that I can be sad, I can be really, really, you know, struggling, but I can also take care of you. And that's a really, really important message for kids to hear.
And this kind of ties into what Brian was just talking about. These are some common kinds of ideas that we all have about talking about death and supporting children around grief. And yes, they're not really the reality. So the first one being, if the child is not talking, we as adults should not talk. That's not the case, right? And sometimes it's about being the adult means that we need to be giving kids the right information, the information that they need, and just providing that space so that they know that we're comfortable to talk to them about it. Then there's the idea that it's better to say nothing than to say the wrong thing. You know, I think it's okay to always say, I don't know if you don't know, and to acknowledge that it's hard to not know if we don't have an answer for something. But it's also okay to just kind of talk about it, about what we do know, and what kind of information we are able to share with the child. Then there's the idea about needing to protect children by either keeping them away from the information or keeping them away from having sad or hard feelings. And the reality is that kids are going to have sad or hard feelings if they experience death. And so just being able to talk to them about it and being able to help them find ways to get their feelings out and that kind of thing is just the really important role for all of us to play as caregivers. Children should not be at the bedside when somebody's dying. And I know, again, this is about protecting children from hard experiences and hard feelings. But the reality is that sometimes it can be really helpful for children to be able to go and say goodbye. Sometimes it can be helpful for them to be at the bedside as somebody's dying. And that there's lots of ways that we can kind of give them preparation and support for that process as well. And then one of the things that we often think is that children might think about it all the time. They might think about death or their person who's died all the time. And the reality that we see in our work is that kids are in and out of grief. We kind of talk about it like puddle jumping, like they'll jump in the puddle for a few minutes and be feeling really sad and experiencing the grief in a big way. And then they'll be, you know, happy and playing with friends the next minute. And that's kind of the way that developmentally children, younger children especially, process grief. But I think that's true of all of us as well. So I think just acknowledging that we can't protect them from their hard feelings is important, and just we're letting them express their feelings when they're having them.
Yeah, and I think that crosses beyond grief too, right? Is I think we as parents just don't want our children to feel difficult feelings in any part of their lives, but that, you know, I think that's an important thing for them to experience and to work through, and to realize that they can get through hard things and we can be there to support them through those hard things. And I think a lot of these myths and misconceptions come from adult perspectives on grief, because in my opinion, I think Ruth would agree with me here, is that kids grieve way better than we do as adults. and some of that is just because we understand the longer term implications when somebody really important in our world dies. We see the longer term kind of things that this will mean, whereas kids don't always see it in that perspective, and that's okay, and that's a positive. And I think we can learn a lot from watching kids kind of go through the grief process, and also like giving kids the options of where and what they do want to participate in, like sitting and going to the bedside of someone who's dying. Give them the option, and if they say yes, then respect that and bring them. If they don't want to go to the funeral, or they don't want to participate in a funeral ceremony in kind of more of an upfront way, but they want to hide in the background, then allow them to do that. So again, I think it's giving options and opportunity with education and support, and then letting them kind of guide us on how and what will be most helpful and beneficial to them through this process. Okay, the 5 C's. We wanted to kind of go through the 5 C's quickly. These are things that often kids will think about when somebody has died. So we just wanted to kind of highlight it. So, sometimes they will ask, did I cause it? Can I catch it? Can I cure it? Who's going to take care of me is often a big one. And how will I stay connected? And we call that continuing bonds within kind of grief work, is kind of ways that families and individuals can stay connected to the person who died, through kind of various rituals and kind of things as a family they can do. Quick example, it's the person's birthday and they loved ice cream cake, and so every birthday, we celebrate their birthday with an ice cream cake as a way to stay connected and to continue that relationship and that bond. And again, this is also to highlight again the importance of honest, accurate information for kids, so that they can understand, again, that no, they didn't cause cancer, and they're not going to catch it, and no, they, it's not something that they are able to cure. Again, it's just giving them concrete information with the information that we know. And again, kind of like Ruth said a few minutes ago, when we don't have a good answer, it's okay to say, I don't know. And sometimes follow that up with, but if we know there is a possible answer, to say, but let's try and see if we can find that out together. Because sometimes kids ask like huge questions that we really don't know, like what happens after death. And we don't actually know, right? And again, cultural and religious beliefs play a part in all of those pieces and things. But again, we can talk and we can imagine and we can wonder together. And again, I think that's all a part of the process for kids. And the other thing with kind of the 5 C's, and helping educate and talk to our kids, is it's important for them to know and to see that they are capable of feeling overwhelmed, having big feelings, but also being okay. That feelings do fluctuate. The puddle jumping is such a great example, that 1 minute it can be really, really hard and really intense and really sad, but the next minute it can be okay and better, whatever that looks like. And that they don't have to and they can't do this all alone, that it's important to lean into each other, and that all feelings are okay. And again, grief can be a really confusing experience based on the relationship that all of us, I'm saying within a family unit, all of us had with the person who died. So grief can be kind of challenging in that way, or, where there's a mix of, sometimes we talk about, kids who feel really relieved their person has died, and that can be for a number of reasons, but then they feel guilty for feeling that, if you're relieved their person has died. So again, really, really stressing to them that all feelings are okay, regardless of what those feelings are.
And this is just a quote that we like that kind of describes that experience of why we, as people who are supporting people that are grieving, need to just provide space and opportunity for people to feel their feelings. So when you try to take someone's pain away from them, you don't make it better. You just tell them that it's not okay to talk about their pain. So we just want to kind of reiterate that point, so that that's kind of a good takeaway, is just to remember to provide space and opportunity for people to have feelings instead of trying to help people avoid their feelings or feel better.
Yeah. And we're going to, if hopefully this will work, we've kind of referred a few times in our slideshow to some of the work of Megan Devine. Like, this is Megan on the screen. She's a therapist in the States, focusing on grief. But she has this really lovely video. It's about 3 or 4 minutes that we want to show that I think really kind of encapsulates everything we've been talking about. Um, and and I want you, as you're watching the video, I want you to think about, like, do you try, and it'll make more sense when you watch the video, but do you try to be the bunny? Which lots of us try to be the bunny, at least at the beginning of the video, and kind of how do we try and, walk away from this conversation being less of the bunny at the beginning. And again, that will make sense, I hope, once we watch it. So hopefully I've optimized the sound. Ruth, if you're not hearing anything, since I'm sharing, can you just holler at me and I'll figure that out?
So, what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. "You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them." Or, "You know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off." Or, "I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture?" We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
Okay. So we want to open it up now. I don't know what our time is, whatever, but I'm okay to hang out. Just to any questions, comments, thoughts that people might be wondering about or wanting to kind of talk about, if
I want to
anything.
say thank you first, and I'm going to stop the recording so folks can
Okay.
openly ask.